This is Sean thinking out loud. If you like these segments, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments. And send in your questions during the week. I'll pick a few and answer them in the upcoming episodes. Alright, quick weekly wrap. This week we hit 4 big themes. First, the loony left's favorite lullaby, 34 felonies. Not an argument, not a policy, a chant. And the real question behind it, is this about justice or is it about weaponizing institutions for scoreboard politics? Second, the resistance mindset. When party insiders talk like prosecutions are part of an era of resistance, that's not automatically a conspiracy, but it is a credibility problem. Because if it's so righteous and clean, why do insiders describe it like a political cell phone? Third, civic literacy. I gave you an update from the writing desk, my second book on the Federalist Papers, and the point was simple. We've got people with supercomputers in their pockets who still can't define republic. And they treat the Constitution like a vibes document. Fourth, citizenship versus fandom. Whether it's prosecutions, politics, or comment section behavior, the dividing line keeps showing up. Are you thinking like a citizen or reacting like a fan? Now, let's tighten it up and get into today's core idea.
Welcome to the noise in my head, where ideas spark like lightning threads. No script, no map, just let it flow. Thinking out loud, let's see where we go. Welcome to the noise in my head, where ideas spark like lightning threads. No script, no map, just let it flow. Thinking out loud, let's see where we go.
Today is Friday, January 2nd, 2026, and the time right now is 10:18 a.m. here in Aracame, Sidonia, Brazil. This is Sean thinking out loud. If you like these segments, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments. And send in your questions during the week. I'll pick a few and answer them in upcoming episodes. Let's talk about the loony left and their favorite lullaby, 34 felonies. They repeat it like a magic spell. Not an argument, not a policy, not a fact pattern, just a chant. And here's the part that should make any adult suspicious. Some of these people don't even use it as justice. They use it as a weapon, a tool, a slogan. And the moment you show them something that smells political, they don't ask, how do we fix corruption? They ask, okay, what's Trump going to do about it? Wait, what? I just showed you the system acting like a political machine, and your response is basically, cool story. What's your team's next move? That tells me everything. You're not worried about justice. You're worried about scoreboard politics. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Democrat strategist Les Smith goes on CNN and says the quiet part out loud, not as a conspiracy, as a mindset. She's talking about Democrats learning they can't only be the party of resistance. And then she says in plain English, they resisted hard from 2017 to 2024. They impeached Trump and they prosecuted him, and he was convicted on 34 felony counts and he still got elected. That's not me putting words in her mouth. That's the transcript. Then Scott Jennings presses her. Are you admitting the New York case was part of organized resistance? And notice what happens next. She doesn't say this was coordinated. She doesn't say we plotted it. She says something else, something still damaging. She calls it a boneheaded move by Alvin Bragg. So here's the honest takeaway. Not she confessed to a conspiracy. The takeaway is a top Democrat voice casually lumps the prosecution into the broader resistance era and then calls the decision-making stupid. That alone is enough to raise a serious question. If this was so righteous and so clean, why are party insiders describing it like a political self-own? When someone describes politics as resistance, what does that imply to you? Is that a governing strategy or a warfare mindset? And second, do you think prosecution should ever be discussed like a political tactic? Why or why not? Here's the standard I'm asking for. Simple and fair. If you're going to chant 34 felonies like it's moral proof, then you should be willing to discuss these questions like an adult. 1. Did prosecutors stretch the theory in a way they wouldn't stretch for anyone else? 2. Did the timing and messaging get used to shape politics? 3. Are we okay with a country where courts are treated like an extension of campaigns? Because once you normalize lawfare as a tool, You don't get to cry later when your side gets hit with the same hammer. If law is a weapon, nobody is safe. And now we return to the dumbest response I keep saying. Okay, but what's Trump going to do about it? You mean besides the obvious? Expose it, fight it in court, replace the incentives that reward political prosecution, and most importantly, make voters see the difference between justice and revenge cosplay. Let me answer the deeper point. If you saw evidence that your side used institutions in a corrupt way, and your first thought is, how do we still win? Then you're not a citizen, you're a fan, and fans don't get a vote in a justice system. Citizens do. Should prosecutors be held to a higher public standard in cases involving major political figures? Because the credibility cost is national, or a lower standard. Because nobody is above the law. Tell me which one and why. Look, Trump's critics can argue he deserved it. Fine. Make the case, but stop pretending the other half of the country is crazy for noticing the political layered all over it. If you want a country where the law is trusted, you don't build it on smug chants and team jerseys. You build it on consistent standards, clean procedures, and the courage to criticize your own side. Drop your answers in the comments and send in your questions during the week. I'll pick the best ones for upcoming episodes. I'm Sean Armstrong. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud. Today is Friday, January 2nd, 2026, and the time right now is 12:14 p.m. here in Araquemes, Rondônia, Brazil. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud. If you like these segments, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments. And send in your questions during the week. I'll pick a few and answer them in upcoming episodes. All right, quick update from the writing desk. I'm working on my second book on the Federalist Papers. My first book came out of my time in school, essays, notes, arguments, mostly focused on what the Federalists were saying and why they said it. But writing this second book is doing something weird to my brain, because the more time I spend with the Federalist Papers, the more I realize it's something that sounds like a joke. But I'm dead serious. People who had just recently discovered the world was round, probably within the last 100 years, were smarter than a lot of you today with your smartphones. And I know what you're thinking, Sean, that's rude. No, it's accurate. Because the Federalist Papers were written in a time when information moved slower than a donkey with arthritis. No Google, no Wikipedia, no fact check with a blue check mark, no algorithm feeding you pre-chewed opinions like a mama bird, and yet those guys were still thinking in layers. Human nature, incentives, ambition, corruption, faction, stability, law, legitimacy. Meanwhile, today, we have people with supercomputers in their pockets who still can't define republic. They think democracy means my side gets what it wants. They think rights are government-issued coupons. And they treat the Constitution like a vibes document. Here's what's hitting me while I'm writing this book. It's almost like you loony leftists read the Federalist Papers, and I'm saying almost because, let's be honest, a lot of you probably didn't read them at all, but it looks like you read them and said, you know, everything they're describing is necessary for a successful republic. Prosperity, stability, equal treatment under the law, limited government, checks and balances, restraint, virtue. We should do the exact opposite. That's what it looks like. It looks like you saw faction is dangerous and you said, cool, let's build our entire politics on faction. It looks like you saw power needs checks and you said, great, let's centralize it and then call anyone who disagrees with a threat to democracy. It looks like you saw human nature doesn't change and you said, no, this time the bureaucrats will be angels. Trust them. They're wearing lanyards. It looks like you saw liberty requires self-government, and you said, perfect. Let's raise citizens who can't govern themselves and then demand more government. And here's the funniest part. The Federalist Papers literally read like a warning label for modern politics. It's like a manual that says, do not do this. This will collapse the machine. And you're like the guy who sees the warning label and says, yeah, but I feel like I should lick the battery. Now, to be fair, some of you are so civically confused that it probably isn't that you read the Federalist Papers and chose the opposite. It's more like you never read them, never learned civics, never studied the founders, and you're just out here doing dumb stuff at scale. So it's not a conspiracy, it's not a master plan, it's worse. It's ignorance with confidence. It's people who couldn't pass a basic civics quiz trying to redesign the system like they're Madison. And that's why I'm writing this second book, because I'm tired of watching people with the attention span of a goldfish lecture the founders like they're outdated. The Federalists weren't perfect, but they understood something that the modern comment section doesn't. A republic only works when people understand rules, limits, trade-offs, and human nature. No slogans, no vibes, not my truth. So here's my question for you. When you look at modern politics, does it feel like people are trying to build a successful republic, or does it feel like they're trying to win a tribal war? And second question, what's the most civically illiterate thing you've heard someone say in the last month? Drop it in the comments. And if you want me to respond, write your comments as a question, because I pull viewer questions during the week and I answer the best ones in upcoming segments. I'm Sean Armstrong. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud. Today is Friday, January 2nd, 2026, and the time right now is 2:22 p.m. here in Aracaju, Sidonia, Brazil. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud. If you like these segments, hit like and subscribe and tell me what you think in the comments. And send in your questions during the week. I'll pick a few and answer them in upcoming episodes. Today's episode is a little different because instead of me just telling you what I think, I'm putting my own work on the stand again. I sent another one of my books in to be debated. This one is Dismantling the Republic, the Role of Progressive Elites in America's Descent into Tribalism. And before we start, let me frame what the book is actually about in plain English. This book is about citizenship, not in the emotional flag-waving sense, in the practical sense. What does it mean to be a citizen? What duties come with it? What rights come with it? And what happens when society quietly replaces citizenship with something else? Because my argument is simple. A republic can't survive if citizenship is hollowed out. And I argue that a major driver of that hollowing out is what I call progressive elites. The people who run institutions, shape narratives, design bureaucracies, and increasingly treat the nation-state like an obstacle to their preferred social project. So the focus isn't regular people who vote Democrat. The focus is the elite apparatus, the bureaucratic machinery, the credential class, the managerial class, the institutional gatekeepers, the people who don't just have opinions, they have levers. And the book argues that these levers get used to produce tribalism and dependency because tribalism and dependency are easier to manage than confident citizens. Now, the book goes into multiple mechanisms, but let me name two up front since they always come up. First, illegal immigration. Not immigration in general, not legal immigration, illegal immigration. The argument is that mass illegal immigration doesn't just change demographics, it changes the meaning of citizenship itself. It turns the border into a suggestion, it turns law into selective enforcement, and it turns citizenship into a status symbol rather than a shared civic contract. Second, the bureaucracy, because bureaucracies can govern without accountability. They can enforce policy without votes. They can shape culture without legislatures. They can punish dissent without ever running for office. And when that grows, you don't get more democracy, you get less. You get a managerial state that slowly replaces civic self-government. So that's the frame. Now here's what I want you to do while listening to this debate. Don't listen like a fan, don't listen like a hater, listen like a juror. And ask three questions the whole way through. Number one, did they accurately represent what the book actually says? Or did they attack a version that exists only in their imagination? Number two, did they attack the argument or did they attack the author? Because if you hear labels and vibes instead of substance, you already know what you're dealing with. Number three, who showed receipts? Who used evidence, logic, history, and definitions? And who relied on insinuation, moral posing, or cheap slogans? Because that's the difference between debate and performance. And this is why I do this. I'm not afraid of disagreement. I'm trying to rebuild something we've lost. A culture where arguments can be tested in public instead of silenced, smeared, or reduced to memes. If you think I'm wrong, good. Tell me why. But tell me with specifics, with arguments, with evidence. So here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to play the debate. I'm going to let it stand on its own. And then I want you to weigh in. Was the book worth buying? And who won the debate? Based on arguments, not emotions. Drop your answers in the comments. And if you want me to respond, write it as a question, because I'm pulling viewer questions during the week and answering the best ones in future segments. All right, let's get into the debate of dismantling the Republic.
Welcome to the debate. American citizenship is, well, it's currently facing some pretty profound challenges that threaten the stability and the very integrity of the Republic. The source material we're looking at today outlines several of these points of erosion, detailing how our shared civic life is being pulled apart by, on the one hand, internal cultural fragmentation, and on the other, the concentration of power in these unaccountable institutions.
It really is a critical moment. We have to define these threats to understand which force carries, the greater weight in undermining a citizen's agency.
Exactly. And so today we're confronting that central question. Which force poses the greater existential threat to American citizenship? Is it the fragmentation caused by identity-based tribalism, or is it the erosion of accountability caused by unaccountable elites and institutions? I'm going to argue that this identity-based tribalism, which prioritizes group grievances over shared national values, is actually the primary source of our democratic failure.
And I'll be arguing that the concentration of power among these unaccountable elites, what we can term the deep state, corporate interests, global organizations, that this is the fundamental structural threat. The cultural issues you're citing, I think, are largely just symptoms of this deeper structural capture.
I can see why you think that, but let me offer a different perspective, one that's really rooted in the foundational requirements of a republic. The greatest threat, as I see it, comes not from some external manipulation, but from the internal disillusion of our civic cohesion. Tribalism, especially when it's politicized along racial and ethnic lines, it just fractures the sense of a shared national narrative. And that's the very foundation we need for citizens to even agree on the rules of the game. We see this, in the political landscape. It's increasingly defined by identity politics, which leverages these insular affiliations to mobilize support. This process, it necessarily leads to profound polarization and social discord because it defines success not in terms of a common purpose, but in these zero-sum group outcomes. You can just look at the proliferation of concepts like critical race theory in public life. Now, proponents might say its goal is to address systemic inequalities, but its implementation is often seen as inherently divisive. It exacerbates societal fractures by emphasizing racial distinctions and past grievances as the main lens for all political action.
Okay.
And crucially, this focus fundamentally undermines core civic principles like, equality before the law and meritocracy. Policies like affirmative action, for instance, they rely on perpetuating racial categorization. They sidelined individual merit in favor of demographic characteristics. And this does more than just shift who gets which opportunity. It breeds this deep resentment among people who feel they're being unjustly overlooked despite their qualifications. When citizens believe the system of reward and recognition is rigged, not by wealth, but by identity politics, well, their commitment to the whole shared project of the Republic just evaporates. When the focus shifts away from unifying goals like constitutional fidelity or universal rights, our democratic institutions, which need a baseline of consensus to work, they just diminish in effectiveness and authority.
I come at it from a different way. While identity politics is, I agree, undeniably divisive, I'd contend its effects are entirely downstream of the real structural issue here, which is the entrenched concentration of power among individuals and institutions that are outside of any effective democratic control. This lack of accountability, it renders the average citizen functionally irrelevant when it comes to policy. I mean, why should people strive for shared values if they can't meaningfully affect any of the outcomes?
Well,
Most explicit evidence for this threat is the rise of these unelected bureaucracies, what some have rightly called the deep state. Agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, for instance, are shown in the source material to basically assume quasi-legislative, executive, and judicial functions all at the same time. This just short-circuits the whole separation of powers doctrine that's supposed to protect us. They don't just enforce the law, They effectively write the complex rules. They investigate and enforce violations of those same rules, and then they often adjudicate the disputes. The whole apparatus operates without any direct electoral oversight.
Right.
And adding to this structural problem is the unprecedented concentration of wealth among a small elite. This directly translates into disproportionate political influence. Wealthy individuals, corporations, they dominate the entire discourse through intense lobbying and institutions like super PACs. And this situation was dramatically exacerbated by the Citizens United Supreme Court ruling back in 2010, which allowed massive amounts of money, often dark money, to just flow into campaigns, effectively buying access and influence. This ensures that legislation, think of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, reflects the financial interests of elite donors, not the needs of the majority. The inescapable consequence is just mass disillusionment. People start asking themselves, why should I even vote? When the key decisions are all made behind closed doors by people I can't hold accountable.
That's a comprehensive argument for institutional capture, I'll grant you that. But I have to challenge the locus of the erosion. I'm not convinced that institutional failure is the starting point. I think institutional failure is often rooted in a fundamental lack of public commitment to a shared civic life. Think about the historical understanding of citizenship. It required active participation, in ancient Athenian assemblies or modern juries, oversight bodies, local referendums. When identity tribalism leads citizens to retreat from this civic sphere, when they prioritize their own group grievances, it weakens the very mechanisms designed to check elite power. If a big segment of the population decides the system is irrevocably biased against their group, they stop serving on juries, they stop engaging in local politics, they stop running for school board. The vacuum that's left is inevitably filled by career bureaucrats and professional lobbyists. So the erosion starts with this internal division, this collapse in civic participation, which diminishes our collective capacity to oppose the very concentration of power you're describing.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that mass disengagement is a rational and predictable response to the institutional capture and economic insecurity that's driven by the wealthy elite? I would argue that this cultural retreat is the result of structural failure, not its cause.
I don't know if I'd call it rational.
Well, look at the economic vulnerability of the middle class. We have hard data here. Reports from the Economic Policy Institute show that real wages for the bottom 70% of workers have been pretty much flat for 4 decades, while the top 1% income has just skyrocketed. When citizens see that, they realize the system is rigged economically. This economic marginalization directly diminishes their ability to pursue what the Greeks called autarkia, self-sufficiency, a concept that's critical for an independent citizen.
Okay.
And let's ground this in reality. A citizen who is struggling to afford childcare or to take time off work to even pay attention to complex regulations, they just cannot participate politically in the same way as an independently wealthy citizen. They become reliant on systems, government safety nets, corporate employment, which further limits their capacity for political independence. So the opacity of the deep state and the blatant influence of concentrated wealth, well, they fuel a much deeper, more paralyzing cynicism than cultural grievance does. People check out not because they hate other Americans, but because they believe their political actions are futile against forces they can't even see, let alone vote out.
While I acknowledge the profound economic pressures, framing it as purely rational disengagement overlooks how identity politics actively undermines the economic solidarity that you would need to challenge those elite interests. If you believe your primary political battle is against other identity groups, if you're taught to view the blue-collar worker of a different race as your fundamental oppressor, you will never form the cross-group coalition needed to fight against the billionaires and the unaccountable bureaucrats. Tribalism ensures that economic grievances get channeled into internal cultural warfare, effectively neutralizing any real collective threat to the elite.
But the elite are the ones actively destroying the constitutional framework. That's far more threatening than any cultural skirmish.
Focusing purely on internal cultural conflict obscures the visible, top-down dismantling of constitutional principles that is being undertaken by these established power centers. The concentration of power is visibly dismantling core constitutional safeguards.
How so?
We see the clear elite push to abolish the Electoral College, to end the Senate filibuster, the attempts to pack the Supreme Court. These are not minor policy debates. These are structural changes that eliminate the checks and balances that were designed to give a voice to diverse regional and minority interests. These attempts, which, they have historical precedent going back to FDR's court-packing attempt in '37, they show a willingness to manipulate the fundamental operating system of the republic to ensure a centralized, elite agenda prevails. These actions directly dismantle the safeguards that protect the republic from what the founders feared most: centralized tyranny.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. While those structural reforms are alarming, identity tribalism weaponizes and delegitimizes the very concept of political opposition, and by doing so, it normalizes using constitutional processes as political weapons rather than safeguards.
Okay.
Just consider the recent history of impeachment, the frequent use of impeachment, specifically the 2 instances against President Trump. That marks a significant departure from historical precedent. The founders intended impeachment to be an extraordinary remedy for high crimes and misdemeanors, not a tool to achieve a political outcome that the voters denied you. By transforming impeachment into this normalized, partisan political weapon, which is driven by deep partisan identity antagonism, you destroy public respect for core democratic rules. And that normalization of political warfare is, I would argue, more corrosive than the institutional maneuvering. When the opposition isn't just wrong, but is framed as an existential moral threat, a core feature of identity politics, the incentive for both sides is to tear down the established rules before the other side can. That poisoning of essential trust makes any system of checks and balances useless.
But the elite willingness to dismantle these structures predates the current rise in this acute identity tribalism. They've sought to centralize power for a long time. They are structurally disempowering the citizen by removing their economic independence, which in turn limits their political leverage. And this leads directly to the third point, which is globalism. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that internal fragmentation is the main driver here. The global elite actively and intentionally works to undermine national identity and sovereignty. They are the primary structural threat.
Go on.
Organizations like the World Economic Forum and international financial bodies, the UN, the WTO, the IMF, they impose policies that inherently prioritize corporate interests and transnational governance over national democratic decisions. They mandate structural adjustments. They enforce complex trade agreements like NAFTA. They establish arbitration panels that can effectively override national courts. This is, as the source material describes it, a form of modern conquest. This elite-driven globalism transfers decision-making power far from any democratic accountability. Internal identity conflicts then become a secondary consequence. They're just the symptoms of citizens struggling to maintain local cultures against an overwhelming, unaccountable transnational force. The primary threat isn't that someone feels more aligned with their race than their nation. The threat is that the nation itself no longer has the sovereignty to decide its own fate.
I understand the force of the globalist argument, but the core mechanism of that transnational influence relies on a weakened national loyalty. My point is that this internal shift toward collective identity is what makes citizens so susceptible to that external influence in the first place. When identity politics promotes racial and ethnic grievances over a collective American identity, when the national story is redefined as inherently oppressive, it creates a civic and psychological vacuum. If you feel more loyal to an international grievance collective than to your own republic, that vacuum is easily filled by these global allegiances. By fracturing the shared cultural heritage, identity politics compromises the nation's ability to act coherently and maintain its sovereignty against these external pressures, whether they're from Beijing or the IMF. The structural mechanisms of globalism are only effective when the cultural ground is already soft.
But the evidence suggests the ground is softened by the relentless application of economic and institutional pressure.
globalism forces local populations into precarity, which is fertile ground for identity-based protectionism. It's the concentration of wealth and power that dictates the trade deals, and those trade deals hollow out the manufacturing base, which leads to economic despair, which in turn fuels the search for cultural scapegoats.
So you see it as a purely economic trigger.
I see it as a structural one. If the citizen had autonomia, genuine political independence, and autarkeia, economic self-sufficiency, they would possess the resources and confidence to resist both the calls of transnational organizations and the manipulations of identity politics. The deep state is what actively removes these pillars of citizenship.
But the deep state requires a public that is too fragmented to coordinate an effective resistance. The concentration of power is sustained precisely because cultural tribalism renders the majority incapable of organizing around shared political goals. You cannot have political independence if the very idea of a shared political culture has dissolved. I mean, if we can't even agree on the basic principles of merit or equality before the law, how do we begin the massive coordinated effort necessary to dismantle the complexity of the EPA's power or roll back the political influence enabled by Citizens United? The structural issues are serious, but they are symptoms of a deeper civic ailment. We have to first restore the foundation of common purpose before we can effectively address the concentrated power that has taken advantage of our self-inflicted wounds.
This debate really highlights a critical, profound tension in modern American governance.
I would still maintain that while unaccountable power structures are deeply dangerous, the initiating threat to civic life comes from the internal fragmentation of identity tribalism. If citizens can't agree on a shared national identity and commit to fundamental principles like meritocracy, the civic cohesion required to organize and sustain opposition to institutional overreach simply can't be generated. The fight against the elite fails before it even begins, because we're all too busy fighting each other.
And I come at it from a different way. For me, the greatest danger is the loss of citizen agency that results from this structural capture. From wealthy donors influencing policy to unelected bureaucrats wielding power that citizens can't touch. When citizens are economically marginalized and politically disenfranchised by this elite concentration of power, while internal cultural divisions become, almost rational, reactive symptoms of a deeper structural sickness. The focus has to be on regaining political independence, autonomia, and economic self-sufficiency, autarkeia. Once the citizen is structurally capable of acting politically, then the cultural disagreements can be managed within a functional framework.
So we're left with the fundamental chicken and the egg question. Does the breakdown start with our shared values or with the institutions we can no longer control? Both the erosion of civic unity and the concentration of unaccountable power present profound and immediate challenges to the Republic. Understanding these tensions and the evidence supporting both sides is essential for any citizen who is seeking to fully appreciate the complex forces shaping our governance today, and to determine the most effective response to safeguarding the integrity of American citizenship.
Today is Saturday, January 3rd, 2026, and the time right now is 8:56 here in Aracame, Sidonia, Brazil. This is Sean thinking out loud. If you like these segments, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments. And send in your questions during the week. I'll pick a few and answer them in upcoming episodes. All right. If you woke up today and thought, there's no way this is real, you weren't dreaming. Overnight, multiple outlets reported U.S. strikes in Venezuela, and President Trump posted that Nicolas Maduro and his wife were captured and flown out of the country, with more details promised at Mar-a-Lago. Now, before we go any further, here's the adult rule. When something is this big, you separate what we know, what's claimed, and what's still unclear. So let's do this clean. First, what is being claimed? The president said the United States carried out a large-scale operation in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement and that Maduro and his wife were captured and removed from Venezuela. Senator Mike Lee also posted that he spoke with Secretary of State Rubio and was told Maduro had been arrested to stand trial on criminal charges in the United States and that the kinetic action was used to protect those executing an arrest warrant. Second, what are we seeing reported on the ground? Witness reporting described explosions and aircraft activity over Caracas in the early morning hours, with smoke visible in parts of the city and confusion inside the Venezuelan government about who is effectively in control. Venezuela's Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was reported demanding proof of life, basically confirming that, at the minimum, the regime is publicly acknowledging it cannot account for Maduro in the normal way. Third, what is the context? This doesn't come out of nowhere. Reports describe months of escalating pressures, strikes on suspected drug trafficking vessels, seizures of tankers tied to Maduro's revenue streams, and a growing U.S. military posture in the region. And there's a political layer, too. Trump reportedly described it as a brilliant operation and planned to address questions about authority and approval at the press event. Now let's talk about what matters, because the internet will turn this into team sports in 5 seconds. If the claims are accurate, the intelligence requirement alone is enormous. This isn't a random strike. This is locating and extracting a head of state under pressure at night during a fast-moving operation. That is either a serious demonstration of capability or it's a serious demonstration of why we should wait for verified details, because big claims demand big proof. Here's where people need to slow down and stop chanting. Senator Lee's framing is essentially, this falls under the President's Article 2 authority to protect U.S. personnel from actual or imminent attack in the context of an arrest operation. But you already know the fight that's coming next. Was Congress consulted? Was there authorization? Does this fit within existing legal frameworks, or is this a precedent that future presidents of either party will use for things you won't like? You don't have to be anti-Trump to take that question seriously. You just have to be pro-Constitution. Even if someone thinks Maduro is a criminal, corrupt, or illegitimate, removing a head of state creates a vacuum. So the adult question isn't just, did we win the raid? The adult question is, who runs Venezuela tomorrow? What prevents fragmentation? What prevents retaliation? What happens to migration flows? What happens to oil markets? What happens to regional stability? Because history is full of successful operations that created long-term chaos. And yes, people are already comparing this to the 1989 U.S. seizure of Manuel Noriega in Panama because it's the closest modern parallel to the concept being reported. If you're trying to reduce the influence of adversaries in the hemisphere, Russia, China, Iran, then you should expect loud condemnation from those blocs and heavy narrative warfare afterward. So don't be shocked if the next phase is propaganda, cyber activity, and diplomatic escalation, because that's how modern conflict looks. Now, 2 quick points before I give you the comment section. First, if you're cheering or raging and you can't explain the constitutional argument in plain English, you're not informed, you're emotionally recruited. Second, if you can't separate I want Maduro gone from I want a government that follows law, you're going to get manipulated by the next headline too. Learning check. Answer in the comments. 1. Do you believe this kind of action falls under Article 2, inherent authority, or should Congress explicitly authorize something this large? Why? 2. What's the bigger risk, doing nothing about hostile regimes in the hemisphere, or normalizing head of state capture as a tool of U.S. policy? And 3. If the operation is truly over, what should the U.S. define as the end state? Regime change, trials, deterrence, or something else? Drop your answers below and send in your questions during the week. I'll pick the best ones and respond on upcoming episodes. I'm Sean Armstrong. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud. Today is Saturday, January 3rd, 2026, and the time right now is 12:50 p.m. here in Araquemes, Rondônia, Brazil. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud. If you like these segments, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments. And send in your questions during the week. I'll pick a few and answer them in upcoming episodes. All right, let's talk about the question everyone is asking. If the reports are accurate and Nicolas Maduro has been captured and transported to the United States, what happens next? I'm not doing internet fan fiction. I'm doing outcomes, process, law, politics, and incentives. Because a capture is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the fight over what the story means. So here are the most plausible paths, step by step. First outcome, U.S. federal criminal process. If Maduro arrives in U.S. soil under a law enforcement framework, the most normal outcome is this. He gets booked into the federal system. He gets an initial appearance before a judge. He gets counsel. He gets charges read. Then the court decides detention, scheduling, and venue. And I want you to notice something here. If this becomes a court case, it becomes a proof case. Not a meme case, not a slogan, a proof case. That means discovery fights, classified evidence fights, witness issues, chain of custody issues, jurisdiction issues, and if the government can't prove what it claims, the case doesn't feel true. It either stands or it collapses. Second outcome, the legality challenge. Even if the charges are serious, the defense will almost certainly attack the capture itself. They'll argue things like, was the seizure lawful under U.S. law? Under international law? Was there due process? Was there proper authority? Was there an arrest warrant? Was this essentially an act of war dressed up as law enforcement? Now you should understand something important. U.S. courts have historically allowed prosecutions to proceed even when defendants were brought into the country in controversial ways. But every case becomes a battlefield of motions, precedent, and politics. And if it looks sloppy, it damages credibility. So a second outcome is simply the case gets delayed and litigated for months or years before you ever get to a trial. Third outcome, a plea deal or cooperation scenario. This is the one people ignore because it isn't cinematic. If Maduro believes his regime is gone and he believes he's facing life in a U.S. prison, the rational move is to trade information for benefit. That could look like names, networks, financial routes, foreign relationships, sanctions and evasion, operations, and the U.S. government would have to decide, do we want the symbolism of a public trial or the intelligence value of cooperation? Because those goals can conflict. A trial is public, cooperation is often private. A trial is about moral narrative, cooperation is about strategic advantage. Fourth outcome, diplomatic storm and international bargaining. If this capture is real, you should expect a global reaction. Allies will ask legal questions, adversaries will condemn it, and Venezuela's internal power structure will scramble, which leads to the next real possibility. This becomes a bargaining chip. Prisoner swaps, sanctions, negotiations, oil negotiations, recognition fights. Who is the legitimate government now? And that means Maduro might not end up as long-term U.S. courtroom defendant. He might become a piece in a larger negotiation. Not because anyone is soft, because states behave like states. Fifth outcome, asylum-style claims and political prisoner narrative warfare. If Maduro's team can't win in court, they'll fight in the media. They'll try to frame him as a victim of imperialism, a kidnapped head of state, a political prisoner, and that narrative will be amplified by sympathetic governments, aligned media, and online influence networks. So another outcome is a long-term propaganda war meant to delegitimize the U.S. action and destabilize the region politically. Whether that narrative succeeds depends on one thing: how clean the evidence is, and how clear the legal basis is. Sixth outcome, the what happens to Venezuela outcome. This is the part everyone forgets. Even if you think Maduro is guilty of everything under the sun, removing a head of state creates a power vacuum. So the real-world outcomes could include a successor consolidating control quickly, or factional infighting, or military fragmentation, or public unrest, or intensified migration. So the strategic question isn't just, did the operation succeed? It's, what is the end state? Stability, transition, elections, international oversight, oil and economic recovery, or chaos? Because history is full of operations that worked tactically and detonated strategically. Now let me give you the clean summary. If the reports are accurate, the main paths are 1. Federal prosecution, 2. Legal challenges that drag on, 3. Cooperation, plea negotiations, 4. Diplomatic bargaining and swaps, 5. Narrative warfare over legitimacy, 6. Regional instability questions. And the truth is, more than one of these can happen at the same time. 1. If this becomes a U.S. court case, what matters more to you? A public trial or intelligence cooperation value? Why? 2. Do you believe capturing a head of state to face criminal charges strengthens the rule of law or risks normalizing dangerous precedents? Why? 3. What should the U.S. define as success after a capture like this? Punishment, deterrence, regime transition, stability, or something else? Drop your answers in the comments, and if you want me to respond, write it as a question because I'll poll viewer questions during the week and answer the best ones in upcoming segments. I'm Sean Armstrong. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud. Today is Saturday, January 3rd, 2026, and the time right now is 2:01 p.m. here in Aracame, Sidonia, Brazil. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud. If you like these segments, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments. And send in your questions during the week. I'll pick a few and answer them in upcoming episodes. All right, let's talk about the comment section again, because some of you treat it like a daycare with Wi-Fi. So we've got Max 4377. This was on my family Christmas card. And normally here's my rule. If someone comments on my book post and we have no point, I take it down. If they have a point, even if they disagree, I'll leave it up. So far, I haven't left many up because most of them are just noise. But Max 4377, Max didn't bring an argument. He brought 2 emojis, a clown face and a poop emoji, which is honestly impressive in its own way because it takes real commitment to say absolutely nothing and still hit send with confidence. Now, Max sounds familiar. He may be the same guy who told Grumpy Farmer something like, when the stuff hits the fan, you'll be easy to find. And that right there is a perfect example of what the internet has done to people. The internet has produced more badasses than SEAL training, Special Forces training, and every martial arts dojo on earth combined. Because online, everybody is a threat. Everybody is dangerous. Everybody is Jason Bourne with a Wi-Fi connection. Meanwhile, in real life, most of these guys get winded opening a pickle jar. Anyway, Max drops the clown and poop emoji like he just landed a knockout punch. So I've replied with what I'm calling a Max 4377 fact check. Because yes, even insults can be audited. Here we go. Fact check time, Max. You didn't make a factual claim. You made a personal swipe. That's not an argument. That's an ad hominem, the rhetorical equivalent of flipping the board because you can't play the game. If you had facts, you present them. If you had logic, you'd use it. Instead, you reached for snark, because snark is what people grab when they're out of depth and trying to hide it. Here's what can actually be verified. Your comment contains no evidence, no citations, no specific claim to refute, no reasoning chain. It is a character attack move designed to dodge whatever substance was being discussed. And here's what cannot be fact-checked, because your comment doesn't contain it. Your reasoning, your argument, your point, because you didn't provide one. So let me keep it simple. You're not mad because I'm wrong. You're mad because I'm not easy to dismiss. You're mad because I don't fold when you posture. You're mad because you can't control the conversation with a drive-by insult. And then I ask the question every grown man should be able to handle without melting down. Is it the fact that I'm smarter than you, or the fact that I can keep a woman that bothers you? Because you're acting like a guy who sees competence and assumes it's arrogance. Not because it is, but because it highlights the gap you're pretending isn't there. So here's my standing offer, Max. If you want to debate, pick one claim and refute it with facts. Quote the sentence, attack the reasoning, bring evidence. If you can't do that, stop pretending you're calling someone out. You're not calling anything out. You're broadcasting that you have no argument. And yes, here's the part that always applies. It must be horrible for you to know this is the best it's ever going to be for you intellectually. It's all downhill from here, and you didn't even peak at mediocre. Now, the second comment I left was even simpler. Hey, Max, it kind of looks like you're upset that my wife doesn't match your preferred modern stereotype. Because that's another pattern, too. Some people can't handle a normal family photo. They see a man with a wife and a life and stability, and instead of thinking, good for them, they reach for childish symbols like a clown and poop. Because mockery is easier than self-reflection. So, Max, here's the deal. If you want to be taken seriously, bring a serious comment. If you want to be treated like a clown, keep sending emojis. All right, questions for the audience. 1. What's the laziest argument you see online? Emojis, insults, or vague accusations? 2. When someone refuses to make a claim, what are they trying to avoid? Facts, accountability, or both? And 3. Should I keep deleting these people or leave them up so everyone can see the difference between argument and performance? Drop your answers in the comments and send in your questions during the week. I'll pick a few and answer them in upcoming episodes. I'm Sean Armstrong. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud. Welcome back to Sean Thinking Out Loud. It is Sunday, January 4th, 2026, and the time right now is 10:28 a.m. here in Arequipa, Sidonia, Brazil. Today's question is simple, and the answer explains a huge chunk of modern political behavior. Why does the loony left take a Trump success as a personal attack? Because for a lot of them, Trump isn't a politician, Trump is a trigger, and their politics isn't policy, it's identity. Let me show you what I mean, and I'm going to quote my own writing here because it's exactly what you see online every day. Quote, if you want to see acute mental illness, scroll through your social media account and just look for the word Trump. That line isn't about disagreement, it's about a pattern. You can post a policy, you can post a statistic, you can post a photo, it doesn't even have to say anything about it. And the reaction is instant. Hysteria, slogans, recycled talking points, and emotional spiraling. So why does that happen? Here are the real reasons. 1. They built their identity around hating him. When your social life, your online persona, and your sense of being a good person depends on hating one guy, then Trump succeeding doesn't feel like a policy worked, it feels like you lost. It feels like you were exposed. It feels like you got corrected in public. And some people would rather melt down than admit they were wrong. 2. Trump's successes threatens their moral superiority hobby. A lot of people don't want results. They want outrage. They want something to be mad at because anger makes them feel important. Trump succeeding takes away the fuel. It disrupts the narrative. It forces them to answer a question they hate. If everything he does fails, why isn't it failing? That's why they treat success like sabotage. 3. It humiliates the expert class culture. Trump's biggest crime socially is that he didn't ask permission. He broke the status ladder. He didn't bow to the media. He didn't bow to academia. He didn't bow to the bureaucrats. So when he succeeds, it's not just political, it's personal to the people who built their entire identity around being the gatekeepers. And gatekeepers hate nothing more than a door that doesn't need them. 4. They can't separate politics from psychology. Some of these people are not participating in debate. They're participating in coping ritual. They don't argue, they vent, they chant, they spiral. And they do it because of the outrage has become a habit, and habits feel like identity. Trump's success doesn't just challenge their politics, it challenges their emotional routine, so they lash out like it's an attack. And if you're confident in your worldview, you don't fear outcomes, you compare results. You bring facts, you debate like an adult. But if your worldview is built on Trump must fail, then Trump succeeding feels like a personal insult, because it exposes the real issue. They don't just hate his policies, they hate what his success says about them. Now, if you wanted my long-form work, go to my book page. It's a simple setup. That's the hub for Super Gringo books and everything I've published. If you're new here, pick a title and start reading. There's a lot there, and it's built to go deeper than comment section slogans. And I want your questions during the week. Drop them in the comments. Politics, media lies, propaganda, economics, culture, censorship, anything. If it's a serious question, I'll answer it on a future episode of Chant Thinking Out Loud. Like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you next time. Today is Sunday, January 4th, 2026, and it is 2:48 p.m. here in Aracaimes, Brazil. Welcome back to Chant Thinking Out Loud. Let's say it plainly, there is no such thing as equality. Not real equality, not the way people use that word, because human beings are not equal in intelligence, physical attributes, ethics, character, and yes, where you live. If there were true equality, I'd be playing for the NBA right now, or I'd be making action martial arts movies, kicking down doors, doing flying spins, and collecting checks like a Hollywood villain. But I'm not, and neither are most people, because the world doesn't hand out outcomes evenly. It never has, it never will. What the real world has is opportunity and consequences, good decisions, bad decisions, and everything that comes with them. Some people are born with advantages. Some people are born with disadvantages, and a lot of people are born with something in the middle and then spend the rest of their lives pretending they're either a victim or a hero, depending on what's convenient. Here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. You can't build a serious life on a fantasy. You can't build a serious country on a fantasy. And everybody ends up equal is a fantasy. What we can do is create systems that protect rights, that reward work, that punish crime, that encourage merit. They give people a fair shot to move up without pretending everyone is the same, because everyone is not the same. Equality of rights matters. Equality of outcome is a lie, and it always requires force, always. So if someone tells you the goal is equality and they mean outcomes, ask them one simple question. Equal to what? And who decides? Now, if you want to go deeper on this kind of thinking, go to my books page. You can find the link in the description or scan the QR code on your screen. On that page, you can click the covers and preview the titles. A few you'll see there include Bloodstained Banner, Understanding Capitalism, the Dynamic Dance of Market Forces and Human Behavior, The American Left, From Liberalism to Despotism, Dismantling the Republic, From Jobs to Justice, the Trump Era Examined, Messiah, The Biden Crime Family, and Dragon Kempo 2.0. Pick the topic you care about, click the cover, preview it, and if you're serious about understanding the arguments, grab the book. Also, send me your questions during the week, drop them in the comments, or send them wherever you follow this show. If you got a topic you want me to break down, policy, culture, history, economics, media, narratives, send it in, and I'll work on it in an upcoming segment of Chant Thinking Out Loud. All right, that's the point. No fake equality, no fantasy outcomes, just reality, opportunity, decisions, and consequences. So here's the weekly takeaway. If politics is just slogans, then courts become weapons. Institutions become teams, and citizens get replaced by fans. That's the theme tying everything together. 34 felonies as a chant, resistance as a worldview, civic ignorance as confidence, and the comment section as a daycare with Wi-Fi. Now here are your questions. Answer in the comments. 1. Should prosecutors be held to a higher standard in cases involving major political figures? Because national credibility is on the line. Or a lower standard because nobody is above the law? Pick one, explain why. 2. When someone describes politics as resistance, is that governance or warfare? And what happens to trust when law gets discussed like a tactic? 3. What's the most civically illiterate thing you've heard someone say this week? Drop it below. If you want the long-form work, books, arguments, definitions, go to the link in the description or scan the QR code on your screen and send in your questions during the week. Write them as questions. I'll pick the best ones and answer them in the upcoming episodes. I'm Sean Armstrong. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud.
Welcome to the noise in my head, where ideas spark like lightning threads. No script, no map, just let it flow. Thinking out loud, let's see where we go. Welcome to the noise in my head, where ideas spark like lightning threads. No script, no map, just let it